Doug Pagitt Radio with Randy Woodley. Randy, when I was a kid, I grew up with my mom listening to Johnny Horton. And Johnny Horton sang that little version of Runnin' Bear, Love the Little White Dove. And when I was a kid, I had this great imagery of these native peoples, and the Runnin' Bear was on one side as a young boy of the river, and White Dove was on the other, and they made eyes for years and then met in the middle and had this. So I had this really kind of, because I grew up in the 70s, so this really kind of idyllic view of indigenous culture people, you know, with Cherokee people and Cherokee pride and all that kind of thing. Are you familiar with all that kind of Americana Indian lore music?
Oh, yes. I think it might have been Sonny James, although Johnny Horton might have sang it too.
Oh, yeah. So you're familiar with Runnin' Bear?
Oh, yeah. I grew up listening to country and western with my folks. Yeah.
Yeah, because here in the studio, between the sidekick and the professional, they were telling me, you can't play that song when you're going to have a conversation with Randy. He's going to
My
be
wife and I were cracking up when I heard that.
He's going to be so offended. A few years ago, he's not going to be offended. It's classic. It's classic
That's right.
70s, classic 70s music. Okay, but before we went into the break, you said how the indigenous perspective can not only save Christian theology, which I don't know. I mean, that thing is in a death spiral. I don't know if we can pull that out, but also save American culture. So paint the picture for us.
Well, I think indigenous peoples around the world, and because I do hold out as a follower of Jesus, I do hold out that the church at some point is going to wake up and be prophetic, that we are going to teach Christians especially how to be human again. And what I mean by that is that Christians have forgotten how to be human because of these silos. So they're, in Western Christianity, it's all about what's written down. It's all about the Word. It's all about the law. It's all about, and so it's there's no necessary correlation between what a person does, for instance, in history, and what they say they do. And of course, the early settlers are the best example of that. It's kind of like that. John Stewart said, I celebrated Thanksgiving the old-fashioned way, invited all my neighborhood to my house. We had an enormous feast, and I killed them and took their land. So this is Christian folks, right?
Right.
People who love Jesus, people who, in Europe had been burning, like Calvin, burned Michael Servetus to the stake, for disagreeing. So we have to rescue theology, as my friend Richard Twist says, from old bald white men.
Yeah,
and
because Christian theology is so formed around a kind of European understanding and cultural set of realities. You're saying if it were built around indigenous people's sensibilities, Christianity could thrive and even have a prophetic voice.
Well, there's of course the European and Euro-American theologies have been normalized, and so what we need to do is make those one of many theologies, and indigenous people's theologies in particular, because we understand what it means to be connected to our planet, to be connected to the earth, to be connected to the animals, the fish, the water, everything. And so we're going to have to, if people are going to survive, there's no other way to do it except to become more indigenous. And who better to teach people how to be indigenous but indigenous peoples? And so we have something very prophetic, which I believe. See, a lot of my friends will say, it wasn't God who brought, Europeans, here. But I believe that during this time of enlightenment, and this, especially the influence of Greek thinking had been pervasive, and now it was being forged in the Enlightenment again, and that God was bringing European people here to learn from the indigenous peoples.
So in your mind, the thing that went wrong wasn't the arrival; it was the lack of learning and the lack of reporting back to others about the way that was found amongst the indigenous people.
Exactly, and there were some great folks, great settlers who came over and actually learned those lessons. And so you can find in every generation, you can find those folks who listened, who learned, and who adapted, but they were most of the time ostracized by their own communities because of that. And the reason that the people couldn't listen, I would say, is foundation because of the kind of theology that they had.
Because they had a theology that's tended to separate the activity from God from the activity of people, and that perspective, or what was it inside that European and heavily Calvinistically influenced theology that you think was prominent in the problem?
Well, it was that gap between the knowledge and the doing, which goes. Jesus dealt with that, right?
Well, and what do you see amongst most indigenous people groups, like American Indian Christians that I know? Many of them tend not to have an indigenous theology. They tend to have borrowed one from the Episcopalians or the Presbyterians or whatever group kind of formed and founded the church that they're part of. Is that a struggle within indigenous communities to still put forth an indigenous theology as opposed to, Native American people being of a particular theological brand from Europe?
Yeah, and that's a struggle that I've been involved in for 25 years. Basically, the majority still would say you wouldn't. They reflect whoever missionized them. In other words, missionaries did a really good job, and so you wouldn't be able to tell the difference between many native churches from their white Baptist, Presbyterian, Methodist counterparts. Even, but when you go to that person's home,
yes,
the members, you would see it Indian. So in other words, what I say is Jesus is welcome in our Indianness is welcome in our home, but not welcome in the church. And that's a really sad commentary. And this is one of the things that most denominations have not reversed their philosophy. They don't practice it as much anymore. It's much more subtle, but they've never come out, repented, and changed their whole way of doing mission. And I think that's one place that we could start.
Well, okay, so how does that happen? Now that we're in the 21st century, so you have such, it seems to me, such a disintegrating kind of indigenous culture in the United States. Am I right about that? That indigenous people?
Right and you're wrong.
Okay, tell me about that.
Yeah, so while we have the highest amount of suicides and alcoholism and even a lot of physical diseases that are associated with stress and colonization and
diabetes and so on.
Yeah, we also have still these incredible values that are intact, which are all, by the way, biblical values. Generosity, hospitality, extended family, all those kinds of things that are still there in spite of the fact. So we are survivors. And what I hope, this is my hope, Doug, is that before we are decimated completely, white folks and other folks around us discover what those values are and say, even in your weakness, the wounded healer idea, help us to understand how to act more Christianly. Because the truth is that most of the Indians were acting more Christian than most of the Christians who came over.
That's intriguing. And when you do indigenous studies, you're not only talking about those who were in North America, but also indigenous communities in Central America, South America, Africa.
Maoris, New Zealand, Aboriginals in Australia, Sami in Sweden, Norway, et cetera. We have a connection, and we share a lot of values. A Maasai friend of mine in Kenya and I went to school together, and we shared so many common values. Because those values come from living with the land, and that's the thing that modernity has done, is it's separated people from the land and created new theologies in the last 500-600 years that have actually harmed humanity and caused Christians to be less human.
And Randy, what kind of language do you use around this? Like even in the conversation today, I've sort of tried to figure out what the best language to use. Native peoples or indigenous people or Indian. How should we think about and talk about these groups in relationship to the rest of I don't know, American culture?
Right. So is it like just the same here? Like, do I say white folks, Anglos? So I think in different circles you hear different things. Most people in America, or many people, especially in the West, grew up saying, Indian, But in academic circles now, folks like to say indigenous or in Canada, First Nations or Aboriginal. So, it's kind of, I think you just have to set the terms with each conversation. And I'm always good. I've got in all my books, I've put at the beginning, I use basically all of them freely, so I don't have any hang-ups, but some folks do.
Yeah, and well, I was going to ask you that. Is that true across the board? If someone feels that kind of comfort to use a wide range of them, will they run into some trouble sometimes with people that are like, oh, that's a more offensive term? Or is across the indigenous Indian Native peoples communities, is that pretty widely accepted that people are struggling to find the right phrase?
It depends. Yeah, again, it depends on what circle you're in.
Mm-hmm.
So, and what part of the country you're in.
Oh, is that right? So there's so much talk in the demographics of the United States and the change from it being a predominantly Anglo world to one influenced more greatly, and maybe in some parts of the country, even 50% of the population being Hispanic. Do you feel like that change is something to be cared for, looked at, thought about as indigenous for indigenous groups in their conversation with the broader culture?
Well, I see it as an incredibly exciting time. And here's why. One, because especially just take the three that we've talked about. You mentioned African Americans, Latinos, and Native Americans. Our histories, and even some Asian cultures, but our histories are so, and then you can add white folks as well. Our histories are so interwoven. It's so hard to silo us and separate us, even though there are reasons for us having, we'll never be in a post-ethnic age in America, I don't believe. But what we need to do is learn to celebrate both the differences and celebrate the places where we join together, where it's indistinguishable who is among the Seminole, who is Native, and who is African American in certain places.
Right. Yeah.
On and on. So, but here's the other part of that. Is that we're seeing less and less in terms of upper management, especially among Native Americans. And look at, the Senate, for example. And what I fear, and the church is the same way. I did this one day. I sat and I looked up all of the different denominations and who the heads of those denominations were. It was mostly a bunch of older white gentlemen with white hair. And I think what we have coming is a potential for some great dialogue and great learning, or we have an American apartheid that's coming. When white folks hold all the power and they're 20% of the population, there's going to be some problems.
Randy, can you hold over for one more segment? I'd love to chat with you a little bit more about that. Okay, so that's Randy Woodley. He's going to stick with us here for a bit. Randy, what I'd love to talk to you about is, where are things working well? Interested in some stories of the beginning of this place where these indigenous cultural norms are starting to spread beyond that and to have the kind of influence. So can we chat about that after the break? Excellent. This is Doug Pagitt Radio, and that's Randy Woodley. You can follow some links over on the Doug Pagitt Radio page on Facebook, and you can get the audio and video of our conversation over at DougPagittRadio.com on Tuesday morning when the podcasts go up. So stick with us here after the break, and Randy Woodley is going to tell us about those who are doing the good right things in the world on Doug Pagitt Radio on AM 950 and DougPagittRadio.com.